Okay, so hello and happy Friday, everyone. Today is December 20th, and this is Basic Beginning Beekeeper Questions, episode number 44. 44 weeks of beginner beekeeping questions answered right here. If you have questions yourself, then please feel free to write them down in the comments section below this video. If you'd like to know what we're going to cover today, please look in the video description and you will see the line item by line item, the things that we're going to talk about. This is the holiday season is hitting. It was 9 degrees this morning, and it is going to warm up. So during the coming week, if you're in my area, North America, the state of Pennsylvania, in the United States, we're going to have warm-ups in the 40s, and that's the time to get out there and clean off your landing boards and make sure that your bees can get in and out through and past their entrance reducers. So it's time to clean those out. And pay attention to the bees. Do not open your hives. So we're going to jump right into this. By the way, tomorrow is the shortest day of the year, winter solstice. And so after that, you can be optimistic because each day will bring more daylight than the day before. So let's jump right into it. The first question comes from Thinless. And he had a question about moving hives, which I did not get to before. And I apologize in advance. I can't answer every question, so I picked the ones that I think people will find most relevant. But this rule about moving your beehives around, and if your bees will be lost. In other words, if you move your hive 50 or 60 feet, the forages that are out come back to the bees, come back to the hive, and they can't find it because they go to the old location. So, is wintertime a good time to be moving your hives around? It absolutely is. And the reason being that your bees aren't flying. So if you're in an area, as I am, where it's very cold and the bees are all inside, they no longer remember their location. They don't know where they live. So if you have a friend that's willing to come out to your bee yard and help you lift hives and move them, all you have to do is set up your hive stand, if one does not already exist, where you want your hives to be. And you want to pick up your beehives, keep a strap on them. Hopefully you've got shipping straps on them to protect them from high winds and bears and everything else that might knock your hives over. And you can lift and move those hives to a new location. And that movement does not bother them. You'll hear a little roar in there, just like if you bump or knock on a hive this time of year. And they will still hold their cluster and make sure nothing comes apart. Don't take it apart to move it as a unit. And this is a time of year when you can move them 10 feet, 5 feet, reorganize your entire apiary. The rule is 2 feet or 2 miles, and that just comes from the idea that if you move a hive from its current location more than a couple of feet, the forager's coming back and the bees departing the following day will not know where they live. Sometimes even when you just change the entrance, you'll see some confused bees that continue to go to where the entrance had been. So even a few inches can confuse the bees. So there is another method. Let's say it's not winter time and you want to move your hives more than a couple of feet, but you don't want to move them several miles. So you can just move them a foot or two every 3 or 4 days, and the bees will go with it and they'll follow it along. Takes more time that way, but you are not opening the hive, you're just moving it. So that's a good method. You could even put it on a cart with wheels on it. You know, you have those garden wagons that hold a lot of weight, have nice inflated pneumatic tires on them. Put your beehive right on that and use that to roll them to a new location bit by bit by bit until you get them where you want them to be. And then there you have it. So there's 2 methods. One in wintertime where you can move it all at once, or if it's summertime, inch by inch, foot by foot. And that way you don't lose your bees and they won't go to other hives. So yes, it's a great time of year to move your beehives. The next one is from James Ferentino, you mentioned that some of your bee weaver queens have swarmed. I am assuming that the queen that replaced the original queen flew to a DCA. A DCA is a drone congregation area, and that's where the drones hover and hope that a virgin queen shows up, and they'll be able to mate with her. So drones spend their whole lives, whenever they can fly, going out and seeking a queen, and they go to the drone congregation area, which may be 50 or 60 feet in the air. So anyway, and mated with a non-bee weaver drone, do you see a significant drop-off in the varroa resistance of the newly mated queen's offspring? And that's a really good question, because we'll go right back to where I get my survivor line bees from. And we use the bee weaver queens, and they are swarmy. And swarmy for me. Why? Because I don't expand the hives and put 4, 5, 6 honey supers on. So when the bees reach a physical capacity, number of bees inside the hive, maybe 70,000 bees, let's say, and the resources are full and the nectar flow is on, they're going to reproduce, which means they're going to generate another colony, which is very different from internal colony reproduction. This is superorganism reproduction. They produce an entire new colony of bees in that hive, and the old one swarms out. And this is a good question, because genetically, I have a bee weaver queen now that's hatched out in there, and her genetics are fantastic, but she's going to fly out to the drone congregation area, and she's going to mate with bees that we don't know about. So hopefully they are feral colonies that have generated these drones. With any luck, I may actually breed her from a drone in another colony that's already in my apiary. But realistically, 3 to 4 miles away, there could be any number of other beekeepers with their own backyard apiaries, and their drones could be flying. So if she mates with those drones, how many drones does she mate with? 15 to 20 on average. So when she comes back after several days of mating flights, and she could be doing these mating flights up to her first 2 weeks of life after hatching, then she'll come back and she will definitely be hybridized. So she will carry some of the traits that she has from the weaver line in Texas, and she will have potentially new traits from the hybridized drones that she's going to mate with. Queens do not mate with drones from their own colony. And the drones don't pursue queens that fly out from their own colony. So the queen's ability to reject a drone is not as easy as it is for the drone to select the queen based on her pheromones and based on her genetics. So drones from the same stock may be less excited about catching up with a queen where they scent the fact that they have a very similar genetic connection. So, do I see a big drop-off? I would say that with my, even because all of my bee weaver colonies this year, including the observation hive, which basically just turned into a swarm machine, they all swarmed. I didn't retain any of the original queens. So going into winter, so right now, none of my bee weaver colonies have their original queens in them. They're highly productive, and we did mite counts this year. Those colonies continued to show good mite resistance, but that is also because the numbers were low when we did mite counts. But we also ended up 2 cycles this year I treated with oxalic acid vaporization. So I've ruined kind of the opportunity to see what those hybridized colonies would be doing as far as their ability to fend off mites, chew them apart, and groom them off themselves, because they have intervened. The mite counts were much lower in those colonies, though, when compared to the Saskatraz colonies that we also introduced this year. We have 3 colonies of Saskatraz bees. So those had higher mite counts within the same apiary. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in today's discussions, the mite issue and treating. So I don't have a pure, baseline of untreated bees to consider, but overall they had a lower mite count than Saskatraz bees in the same apiary. The highest mite count in my apiary came from a feral swarm of bees that I collected that were emitted from a house that is over 120 years old, And bees have been living in that house for as long as the occupant can remember. And he's been there since the 60s, I believe. And they did multiple swarms out of it. So I was interested in that stock. So when they called me and asked if I wanted a swarm from those bees, I said I would. And I went out there and I collected it. And it was a tiny swarm. And they're making it. So, but also they got oxalic acid vaporization treatment. And they're somewhere between the Saskatraz and the weaver bees as far as mite counts go. So they actually, because they've survived as a feral colony on their own, untreated, untended to, in the attic of a very old home, they were a good source of bees that I wanted to look after. So significant drop-off in mite resistance? No, but then I treated them. So unfortunately, James, I can't, it'd be perfect if I had nothing but bee weaver bees, left them untreated, allowed them to swarm, and then see what the hybridization brought as far as their ability to keep their hygienic behavior and their varroa resistance. So, next, Tulips Moran, venting in the south, no heavy winter. Okay, and this question was so long I had to print it out. So, thanks for the info. Learned so much. As a new beekeeper and looking to add hives this year, I'm trying to decide, do I want all mediums and avoid the need for different size frames and foundations? It certainly would be easier for me to lift mediums rather than deep boxes. So if you don't know, beehive boxes come in 3 sizes. They come in the full size deep, which is what you see most brood boxes. That's a brood box right there. They generally hold 8 or 10 frames, and then there's an opportunity to get a medium-sized box, which holds medium-sized frames. These are frames that would go into a medium-sized box. And then there's also a shallow super, which I don't use, but some people do. So you have 3 choices in sizes. The most popular are the deep box for brood, the medium super for honey and extra stores beyond that first box. So, do you think they would perform better drawing out air and humidity from the bottom and exhaust off the top, or would it be better to go with 9 frames and space accordingly in each box? Also, what do you think about the gabled roof cover versus the flat cover? Some folks say the gabled roof helps ventilate flow. I have a couple of honey flow supers. So either size, length, throughout the box, I can go either way. Thanks for your response. All right, so the venting thing comes up a lot, actually, and we talked about this extensively at a recent beekeeper meeting in my area. So the thing is, I don't think you need a top vent, even if you live in the south where it's really hot. And one of the reasons for that is we know that looking at feral colonies, and I encourage you to look into Dr. Tom Seeley's research on feral colonies, and he is from Cornell University here in the United States in the state of New York, Ithaca. They find that even large feral colonies of bees, or naturally living bees without the help of people, are doing so with 1 entrance. Now, in the south, I don't think it's a lot different. There are people doing rip-outs, for example, of colonies that have moved into the sides of houses and things like that. And you can see how many openings they have, even with really large colonies of bees, because they do rip-outs that might have a colony inside with comb that extends 4, 5, and 6 feet. So this is well beyond the size that you would have in a normal beehive in your apiary. The bees are venting that entire colony through a very small entrance hole. So in general, those entrance holes are about 1.5 inches to 2 inches in diameter. So the entire colony is venting. That means they're bringing air into the colony, and that's why the brood is generally the closest to that entrance. That the brood is where the airflow is the most critical, because you have developing bees that are in capped cells often that have to respirate, and they need a constant changeover of that air because we need to get the CO2 out, and we don't want them to suffocate. The other thing is climate control. Where does that happen inside your hive? Well, the climate control happens primarily over the brood. So again, the brood are closest to the entrance already. So if you've got a bee box and you're stacking the boxes up, and up here you've got all your honey, and then you've got another box of honey, and then you've got brood down here, most of the ventilation is occurring down here in the brood area. Although they will ventilate up through the honey. Why? To dehydrate it. And that's where this discussion comes in. A lot of people want to help out their bees by putting an upper entrance in. And that allows the bees to vent right through. It seems natural that heat rises and that then it would just vent through the top. And there are other problems associated with having open vents and open secondary access points for your bees in southern climates. What else gets in and out through there? Small hive beetles, for starters. So if you are also trying to control the small hive beetles and you've got beetle traps and you've got one of those baseboard beetle traps that catches them when they're coming and going, the beetles are going to bypass that upper entrance. So there's a lot to consider, but if we're looking at what the bees do themselves, and what obviously I don't live in the heat that's described here, but the other thing is the frame spacing question does not have a lot to do with the ventilation and congestion inside the hive, because what's going to happen normally if you've got a 10 frame hive, you've got 10 frames in it. Now, some people in the honey super want to make sure that the honey extends well beyond the surface of the frame so they can uncap evenly when they're extracting the honey. So when you put up a 9 frames in a 10 frame box, that just means that you're spacing the frames out wider, and then what do the bees do? They're going to extend the honeycomb out further until you've got bee space between the honeycomb. Sometimes when you pull out those frames, it's even kind of wavy, but what they've done is they've maintained this 3/8 of an inch, roughly, corridor between the honeycomb. So even when you space them out to give them what you're thinking is more room, the bees draw out the cells longer, so the space between those frames remains the same. So whether you're doing 9 frames in a 10 box or 10 frames in a 10 box will really have nothing to do with how well they're going to be able to ventilate it, because the bees are going to fill the space. Anything beyond 3/8 of an inch, the bees are going to add burr comb and they're going to start to fill that space on their own. So as a ventilation practice, reducing them to 9 in a 10 frame box doesn't really change anything. So the thing is, even in hot climates, so the other thing is the roof situation that he was talking about. The gabled roofs provide here's your inner cover, here's a gabled roof outer cover. The inner cover, there's an airspace here. Now you can put a screen up there and ventilate that if you want to. And then on your inner cover, there's a hole where you can put a screen over that too, which prevents them from using that as an exit and an entrance, because if you have that gabled roof space, and if the bees have access to that space, they're going to fill that with comb as well. But as a ventilation opportunity, you can put screens in there and then see what the bees want to do. So when you put the screens in over your inner cover, which is the feeder hole there, and then you've got a gabled roof, and if you've put a vent hole in that, the bees will let you know if they want to leave it open. So to prevent that from being used as an upper entrance, a physical entrance that the bees come and go through, and if you want it just for ventilation, put the screens up there. And then you're going to see that when that screen material covers the hole, it's very easy for the bees to seal this up with propolis. And they're going to let you know, do they want venting or don't they? And again, where's the most venting? Down where the brood is. So you don't really need to have the upper entrance. And the other thing is, sometimes bottom boards are not solid. So you can provide more airflow through a screened bottom board. Here's an example of a screened bottom board. So these holes are pretty good sized, and you can also put core flute through the back. And they're usually, when you have a screened bottom board, there are a couple of height adjustments here. So you slide the core flute in here, and you've got 2 settings. So you can have it more vented up to the top if you need to close it off for some reason. And you can remove it altogether and just have an open screened bottom board. And that's max venting through the bottom. So the bees can get the air down through the bottom and through the main entrance of your hive without establishing an upper entrance. So in my opinion, if you want to add venting because you live in a really hot area, I would do it through the bottom. Plus, if you have a screened bottom board like the one I just showed, if they are grooming off varroa or they're chasing small hive beetles and things like that out, they will fall through that screen and have a very difficult time getting back up into the hive. So I hope I answered that question. Now here's another question, and the person's name is CRZRCK, so I'm not sure what that stands for, but the question is, how do you determine when to remove old comb? So normally it's the brood comb that really starts to look bad very early, and that's because the bees are traipsing over it all the time. And if you've looked at older beehives, you'll see that when you pull the frames out, some of the comb gets so dark it actually looks coffee bean colored. Made me thirsty thinking about coffee beans. It gets so dark it looks coffee bean colored, and it also gets very dense. If you've ever tried to scrape away old brood comb, it's very fibrous and it's very tough. So what's going on? Let's talk about what honeycomb does in the first place. Honeycomb is made by the bees, unless you've got some kind of new synthetic honeycomb. But the honeycomb in general is drawn out. It's beeswax. It's made by the bees, and it gets dirty because the bees are traipsing over it all the time, and they have pollen on their feet and everything else, and they just keep working that wax, and they continually make it darker. What else happens in the brood frames? When you look at brood frames, the cells are made initially by the wax-working bees, and those are young bees. That's one of the early jobs inside the hive. And they're using their wax glands and they're making it. So they make the dimensions of that hexagonal cell to match the bees that are residing in that hive. Now, in a brood comb, what is happening aside from once that physically is established, the bees are reproducing there. So we have eggs that hatch, and then we have the larvae, and then we have the pupae. And when they enter the pupa state, which is when they cap over that frame, that cell, there's a cocoon in there. It's very thin. And when that bee hatches out, guess what gets left behind? A layer of that cocoon. So what's happening is with each successive cycle of brood, that's eggs are laid, broods develop, brood hatches, they're contributing material to the cell until eventually that cell is too small for the queen to lay eggs in. The queen, if you notice, when she's going around inspecting cells and deciding whether to lay her eggs in that cell or not, she's measuring it. She sticks her head in there, she's inspecting, she decides whether to put her abdomen in there and deposit an egg or not. As these older cells get thicker walled and the size of the cell is reduced, the queen will eventually stop laying her eggs in there because she'll recognize that as a space that's too small for eggs and for brood development. So when do you decide to pull it out? I pull it out when it's just dark and looks bad. The other thing is what's building up in that wax as well. Pesticides and herbicides and things that your foraging bees are exposed to become ultimately embedded in what's called the liver of the hive, which is the comb structure. So there are trace elements building up in those frames also, which is another reason not to leave the frames for many years. And this is a point that some people like to argue about, that old comb is fantastic and everything else. So it's twofold. One, it physically becomes not usable to the bees as brood, so they can put pollen and they can put nectar in it if they want to. But the other thing is, it's kind of your job to refresh that comb. So how do I do it, first of all? What I do is I don't pull all the frames at once and put all new frames in at once. I do every other frame. So when when it comes into springtime and we have some old comb hanging there that doesn't quite look great, I will pull that out before it starts to get eggs in it, and I will put a replacement frame right in its place, and I do that for every other frame. And then the following year, I'll pull the darker frames that I left from the year before. And so I don't do an all-out or an all-in kind of thing. I pull the oldest and worst frames as I see the comb and see the condition, and I get them out of there. Plus, if they're, if they're starting to convert a lot of it into drone comb, if they're completely reworking it, then you could go ahead and pull those out too and let them build some fresh comb. Because by doing every other one, by the way, we're still leaving them with resources to park their nectar and pollen in, and also a place to reproduce. But we're also not causing them to have to restructure a whole bunch of comb at one time. So that's what I do. I don't other than just the physical appearance of it and how dirty it looks, and I just like the look of fresh drawn comb. So that's what's happening in your comb, and so the chemical buildup in your comb, and you can send your comb off for testing if you want to. You may not want to know what pesticides are residing in your comb, but that's how I determine it. It's just a judgment on what it looks like and how well I think it's doing for the bees. Next is from Robert Howells. How did you become interested in beekeeping? I'm going to give you a really short story about that. I used to watch documentaries that were first coming out, Silence of the Bees, all these stories about colony collapse disorder was coming out. So 2007, I was volunteering to do photography and videography to show the condition of the bees. And of course, I was going to apiary yards, and I was meeting up with our state bee inspector, whose name I won't name right now, but and so that I could see the conditions and document them as a volunteer. So I used my cinematography and photography talents. I'm a professional photographer, and was volunteering and giving them images so they can help document everything from American foul brood, everything that could go wrong, chalk brood, and so on. So what happened was I photographed a lot of those conditions right away. So we went to one bee yard, for example, that had everything that could be wrong in a bee yard all in one bee yard at one time. Bears had attacked the bee yard. He had chalk brood. He had foul brood. Turned out to be American foul brood. They had to burn everything. The apiary was quarantined. I basically got everything I needed in one space at one time. Terrible for that beekeeper. Excellent for someone who's trying to find these conditions and document them. So then the bee inspector, I don't know if he just got tired of me showing up all the time, but he said, I needed to keep my own bees. I needed to have my own hives. In fact, it would be great if I started with 2 hives, then I could do this documentation on my own property. And that just seemed perfect. Why am I running all over the place, getting these pictures and sequences and everything else that I need, when I could be doing it right on my own property? So since I had finished my Australian emu evaluations and other animal stages of growth and development that I was working on, I did have space to keep bees, so I started keeping them right here. Then I could do my photography and video of bees that I own, and they were more accessible than going to somebody else's property. So that's how I got started. So I had my first colonies in 2007. And so prior to that, I was photographing and documenting conditions in beehives after colony collapse disorder was announced, because I was concerned and I wanted to know more, and then used my photography as my foot in the door. That's my story. So, and here we are, coming up on 2020. So the next question is, Fred S. I heard a speaker say that bees only have a 3-day memory. So you should close up a hive for 3 days prior to the move, if not moving the bees several miles away. This is so the bees will relocate themselves to the new location. With the winter here and the bees clustering in winter, good time to relocate hives, or will the natural jostling that will occur be harmful in making the bees break cluster? Okay, now we already talked about moving hives, and so I answered Fred's question in that I think wintertime is a fantastic time. But the question is, he heard that bees have a 3-day memory. So I don't know about a 3-day limited memory, and the reason I say that is bees definitely do remember locations, and they definitely do. When they find a great resource, nectar, feeding station, whatever it is, they return to it with very good accuracy. So the question is, do bees only have a 3-day memory? Now, I didn't have time to do, any research on what's been done to evaluate a honeybee's memory. So if you've found some source, if you know some study that's been done, some viable study that showed what the limits of a bee's memory are, please put that link down in the comments section below this video, because I'd be very interested in reading more about it. The other thing is, what made me think about this logically is where I live, sometimes spring will hit and the bees are out foraging, but then we'll get a solid week of rain and terrible weather, and the bees are basically trapped inside the hive and they can't get out to forage. So, and then I noticed that places that they go. For example, where I have my mineral resources for the bees, which is sea salts mixed with purified water. And the other thing is an open feeding station during times of dearth, or to kick them off in spring, or to give them that fill-in just before going into winter. The bees locate that. Once they've located it originally, they return to it very fast. So if they only have a 3-day memory, that week of rain would basically give the entire hive amnesia. So then they would be exploring everything brand new as if they had never found these water resources, mineral resources, and food resources before. So on a practical level, I think they maintain a memory of the physical location of resources that they need beyond 3 days. So that's the big thing that hits me. We've already answered what I think about moving hives, and so closing them up for 3 days is not something I would do, because what have we done? We've made it so they can't go to the bathroom. We're preventing them from coming and going, getting rid of their dead. Bees that are about to die or that are toxic, that want to leave the hive, can't. So closing up a hive for 3 days is not something I would personally do. I would practice what I talked about before, which is moving them in little stages. And the other thing is take advantage of wintertime and move them all at once if you want to. But the 3-day memory thing is interesting because I think they go beyond that. Just based on the description of what I just gave there. They do remember where resources are. But it's a curious area, and I want to do more looking into bee memory. So if you're somebody who knows about that already or knows of studies that have been done, or even Fred, if you want to put a link of where you learned that to begin with, I would be very interested in following up on that even more. Next, we get to question 7. Peter Zweck. I have plenty of wild hives on my farm. His farm is 2,500 acres, including a couple in trees quite near my house. Both are long-lived. Question: if I set up a complete flow hive near those wild hives, what are the chances of a swarm from one of those hives settling in my new hive? Perhaps with something like Swarm Commander. Or will it be better to use a dedicated swarm trap? I'd much prefer to start with something local and acclimated rather than buy them in. This is something, and I'm glad this was asked, because a lot of new beekeepers don't understand how they get their bees. So potentially you could set up a hive that's empty and just has frames in it, put Swarm Commander in there, or lemongrass, which is what makes them think that it can be occupied. Scouts is what you're trying to get. If you do that, use a single deep, but the chances of the bees actually occupying that may be very low. The reason is, there's a couple things that struck me here. One is it's a brand new hive. It doesn't smell like bees. So the chances of having frames, this something to do with old comb that we talked about earlier. Pull that old comb and use it in your bait hives. And don't put food and resources in it, because then it could just be robbed instead of getting the bees to occupy it. But the more it smells like it's been occupied by bees before, the more likely it is to attract scouts from a colony that is about to swarm. So it can be done, but you can also blow an entire year without bees. So people that set that out, some people think beehives are like a birdhouse. And I'm not saying that, Peter thinks this way. But some people think, I bought a flow hive, as he's got, and I put it out in my yard. I put it out in my garden, and the bees never came. I hate that thing. It doesn't work. Okay. You have, as I said, the potential for bees to move into it, but the chances of that are extremely low. Here's what would make those chances high. Right now, if you're in an area where there are not a lot of places for feral colonies to occupy, if there's a bunch of forest around you, but it's actively forested, actively maintained, and they remove all the snags, which are the dead trees, if there are not trees that would allow for bees to move in, then when bees do swarm out and they're looking for a place to live, if you've got the only cavity that they can move into, the chances are increased. But if you live in an area where they can find lots of places to live and lots of shelter and areas for them to occupy, then the chances of them moving into a brand new box are slim to none. Now in my bee yard, every year I have bees move into my empty equipment, but that's empty equipment that has had bees in it for years. So it's just set off to the side, and I leave it on a rack off to the side on purpose, hoping that I'll just walk out there one day and, hey, look, there's a whole colony of bees living there. And that's what happens a lot. I was being inspected by the state inspector, and I had an empty box, and he goes, what about this box over here? I said, that's empty. I just stored it. He goes, I don't think that's empty. And we look at it, and sure enough, it's full of bees. So if it's old equipment that's been used and smells like bees and has propolis in it and feels like a safe place, it's weatherproof, and it's got the right physical dimensions, the bees have a chance of moving in there. But a brand new box with brand new frames, just set out in your bee yard hoping to attract the bees, I think you're set up for huge disappointment. So, how do you get your bees? You buy packages of bees, or you buy nukes, or here's another route. If you want feral bees that are already acclimated to your area, contact beekeepers in your area, call the local fire department, call the local police department, not 911. Call them up and say, hey, I'm a beekeeper. If you get a call for swarms, somebody's got a swarm of bees in their yard, I will come and get them for free. The fire department would be happy to pass that on to you. The police department, if they get a call about a swarm of bees in someone's yard, they will be happy to pass that on to you as well. And if you have a beekeeping club in your area, let them know you want to start with bees, you don't want to buy bees, and you can go with an experienced beekeeper, bring your box, and have them put that swarm of bees right in it. And now you've got the local bees. You collected a swarm, you've got an old queen who's in lay, and you'll have a quick start that way. Much better than just setting out a hive and hoping that the bees occupy that. Now, I had bees occupy empty hive equipment this year. I put out swarm traps, because the other question here was, what if I put out specific swarm traps with Swarm Commander in them? I put out swarm traps this year at the perfect height, facing the right direction, near fields, and those did not get occupied. And what did get occupied were hives that were already just sitting in my apiary. So, very interesting. One thing we know for sure about bees is we don't know anything for sure about bees. So, that's my recommendation. Want local acclimated bees? Get with somebody and have them collect a swarm. I often will collect swarms if my apiary is full. But if there's somebody new, because I've helped a couple members of my Beekeepers Association, the first bees they ever had were swarms. So I just meet them somewhere, tell them to bring their box, and they will hive the swarm, and then they'll take that home, and now they're beekeepers. So that's what I like to do. And it's what I recommend for you too. Go after swarms. Don't wait for them to come to you. Number 8 here is from Andrew Farrow. If the bees make all this honey, they must do it because they need it. Then we come along and take it. Doesn't that leave the bees short? Okay, and this is a common question. In fact, this is something that people who are against beekeepers in general often say. You've got these bees and you're just taking their honey because you're greedy. And I'm not saying this is, Andrew. Andrew obviously watches my videos, so he must be, a friendly. But there are people that say beekeepers just steal everything from the bees and profit from it and leave them with sugar water. They just throw a bunch of donuts at them, and then they don't make it. That is hopefully not what you're doing. The people that are watching this channel, hopefully, understand that the best thing for the bees, remember, we are backyard beekeepers. So that's what my whole channel is centered around. People that are keeping bees for the enjoyment of having the bees and learning about them. So what is the first thing in spring that bees are trying to do? Well, they're trying to build up their numbers. They're trying to store their resources. All this happens in a flurry of activity because they're trying to prepare themselves for winter. So February, March, April, they're already preparing for winter. That's all bees are doing. They're an organism that is trying to survive in an ever-changing environment. So we as beekeepers have to be responsible about how much honey we take off. So again, when you watch the way I do it, I put a deep box out there, minimum, and that's for brood, but that's also where they store their honey and their pollen and other resources that they need. And then as that fills up, and let's say it's a 10 frame box, when 7 of those frames are full of resources, we put a medium super right on top of that. And now they can start to store more resources up in that next box. Is that for me? No, I'm not going to touch that. If this colony only fills that second box and doesn't, show that they could complete that and then go on to another one, do you think I'm taking honey away from that beehive? I am not. Everything that they've put there is going to stay there, and they're going to keep it to get themselves through winter. So every colony that I have, if they haven't produced more than a deep and a medium, if they haven't produced boxes beyond that or filled a flow frame beyond that, I take nothing from those colonies. I also tell other people that are learning from me that you should not be taking honey off of any colony that does not produce a surplus beyond what will get them through winter. So, it's a matter of personal responsibility and integrity when it comes to beekeeping. There are some new beekeepers that, we want to succeed at everything. And how do people know that you're succeeding in beekeeping? Well, look at all the honey I got. Look at all this honey I got from my bees, So I must be doing something right. It must be good. I've seen people that their bees never built up on their own, and they put a feeder on and they feed sugar water all year long. And then that person who's been feeding sugar water all year long takes honey out of the hive and wants to give you a jar of honey. I mean, it's honey, but it's derived primarily from sugar water. So, but there again, the pressure on a beekeeper who may have some doubters, maybe somebody didn't want you to set up a beehive, so you're going to show that it's a success by showing that you got a bunch of honey. Generally I don't mention other video channels on YouTube, but when FlowHive came out, a lot of people were being highly criticized. First of all, I'm one of them. I mean, when I started using FlowHives, the first thought is, well, you just want the honey from those bees. No, I don't. I want to learn about the FlowHive and I want to see if it works. But there were people who got the FlowHive, one deep box, Flow Super, right on top of that, nothing in between so that the bees could build their stores for the wintertime. They pulled all the honey out of that FlowHive the minute that it had the honey surplus in it, filled a bunch of jars, because they needed to, in their mind, demonstrate to everybody else that I'm a successful beekeeper. Number one, the FlowHive works. And number two, look at all the honey we got. And then those people evaporated. They didn't answer any questions about how did it winter? How did your bees make it? How did it go? They jumped on the sensationalism of it worked, we got honey, this is it, this is great, we're fantastic. And now there's no discussion beyond that first year of beekeeping with a lot of those people that started. And one of the reasons I speculate, since they won't answer questions, I speculate that they took too much honey off, they left their bees in that box with whatever resources were there, didn't really understand how bees prepare for winter, and then they left them with little to nothing to get through winter. And if they don't have stored honey and resources, the chances of those bees making it are greatly reduced. And a lot of people feel like, well, I'll just feed them sugar or whatever, through winter. Nothing is going to be better for the bees than the honey that they've stored in their own comb. So I am telling people, to answer Andrew's question, and of course this is northern beekeeping. Remember that the FlowHive and some other beekeepers have an influx of resources into their hives all year long, 12 months out of the year. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about people that have a profound dearth period. A dearth is just when the environment is no longer supporting the bees, which is what drives them into a state of torpor, which is what drives them into a state of survival. And so people that live in areas like that need to allow the bees to build their resources first. Then, when can you take off that extra honey? In the spring, when there are more resources and more nectar coming in. Now, once you've done that and the hive strength is good, those bees can forage much better and they'll bring in more resources than they need. A hive can even become honey bound. They can bring in so much. They can fill a hive. I was talking with a state bee inspector. Some bees will fill the hive with pollen, which is ridiculous. He blames that on too much inbreeding of a line of bees, that they've become incapable of being diverse in how they're bringing resources into the colony, which was very interesting. But we want them to bring everything they need, and if the hive strength builds and they fill that medium super, that's when they start filling everything else. So what are bees doing? Instinctively, they are bringing in all the resources that they can find whenever the resources are available. So they don't stop. They're going to fill every area that they have available. Now, in a wild colony, in a feral colony, that's a very finite space, so they can become full, they get honey bound, and then what happens? They swarm out, they generate another colony, and they divide the resources, and off they go. In a controlled environment where people are managing the bees, when they start to fill up, we can give them another space. You don't do that in a tree, but we do that because we've imitated the tree by giving these Langstroth boxes. And some people say that the 8 frames do better than 10 frames because they better resemble the physical space of a tree. So then whenever they're filling up, we add another box. Okay, so that shut them down. The bees don't have to swarm right now. There's more space. They're not becoming honey bound. And then they add another box and another box. And if you look at southern climates, go down and look at some of the Georgia beekeepers that have 8 or 10 boxes high. You'll never see that in my bee yard, but that's because I'm using flow supers. And now instead of adding more boxes, we drain off a couple of frames and the bees refill those frames. So that saves me from having to continue to stack them up. But bees inherently collect more resources than they will ever need, and that's what drew people to manage bees in the first place, and to collect that surplus and then have the bees still survive to live another day and build up again. So it is possible that some beekeepers do exactly what he's asking about. Some beekeepers do take off more than they should and leave the bees without enough to get through a winter or a dearth period. It's also why where I live, a lot of people don't take honey off in spring. They might leave it on because what if we have a really long, wet spring and the bees can't get out to get their resources? They may still be needing to draw upon the resources that they've carried over from winter still. So there's a lot to it, but bees inherently save more than they need if they have the space to save it. So I'll get off my soapbox on that. Number 9, what are your thoughts on drone pollination services? Okay, so here's the thing. I have always, and people keep asking this, and I thought, well, I've seen the little teeny micro drones that they don't even have mechanical functions. They have these bimetallic flexors for their little wings and stuff. And I thought, well, those little things, what's the point? What's the threat? So from a pollinator standpoint, would honeybees be threatened by people that decide to use these mechanized drones? So I did a little tech dive on what's going on there. And it's actually more involved than I originally thought, because it's not just those little tiny mechanized drones that fly on very limited power, and the technology has advanced beyond that. And it led me to some other stuff here too, because guess who has already filed a patent and had their patent application approved for little drone bees? Walmart, of all places. Walmart is getting ahead of the game, thinking that the bees are going to decline, that chemical companies are going to want to continue to use their chemicals on the crops, pesticide and herbicide, and that eventually the bees will fail as pollinators. So they're ahead of the game in getting a, by the way, you can't even see, I don't know if there's open access to see an application for a patent, to see what the patent involves, but Walmart is in the process of patenting a drone, a mechanical man-made bee that will pollinate plants. But then you think, yeah, well, the weather, the wind will kick up and those little things will just be done. And, birds will think that's a living thing and they'll crush these little mechanized, bees and that'll be the end of it. It gets bigger than that. What is one of the biggest? So if you're a commercial, remember we're backyard beekeepers, but I want to talk to you about this because I want you to know about it. I've always kind of brushed off this question because mechanical pollinators, who cares? But here's something I want you to look into. It's called a drop copter. Now this is a big deal because for commercial beekeepers, we're backyard beekeepers, but we should be aware. Commercial beekeepers depend a lot on migratory pollination services. One of the biggest areas that get pollinated from these migratory beekeepers, these huge commercial operations, the almond groves in California. When it comes to almonds, they have the lion's share of almond production in the world. Okay. Now what happens when the pollinators, the beekeepers, show up with their 18-wheelers and they don't have enough bees that year? Or some of the truckers out where I live, some of the pollinators that were contracted just never showed up, period. So here's what happens. They have a very narrow window when the almonds are in bloom. And they've also, if you've watched, there's a documentary I highly recommend called More Than Honey. Watch that and you'll get some insight. It's huge money. So here's the thing. This drop copter thing has come out. And these are huge drones. I'm talking like, drones that you would use to make a movie, a motion picture. They're huge. And they have a special mechanized system. And one of the companies that's working on this mechanized system that meters the location of the drone, how much pollen to drop, is by a company called Parrallax, PARRALLAX.com. So they're partnering together, and what they're doing is they're producing drones that can fly. They fly 8 to 10 feet above the canopy, so just off the top of the trees. And because they have built-in GPS, they're very effective, and they're not affected by weather. And these things fly up and down these rows, and they can cover more ground in less time than anything natural. So they can fly in 30 degrees Fahrenheit. They can fly all the way up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So when the bees are grounded due to a sudden cold snap, drones like this are not grounded. It gets worse. And by worse, I mean better for the grower, worse for the beekeepers that are commercial. If I were a commercial beekeeper that provided pollination services to these big almond groves and places like that, I would be watching this very closely because the effectiveness of these drones over the honeybee pollination services that are being provided is cheaper, and it produces 25 to 60% more effective pollination. All it does is dumps the pollen in the air over the trees and counts on wind and everything else. And in some cases, they're counting on the cavitation from these big blades that are, of course, the flight system for the drone. They blow the pollen down and onto the trees, and it's actually working. So this is something I wasn't even thinking about when people kept asking me, what do you think about, drone pollinators? I'm thinking of the tiny imitation bees, which I see as not terribly effective and very expensive to use. These drop copters are cheaper than bringing in truckloads of bees on pallets, and of course more dependable than the actual living bee. So look up, here's another, if you want to look into this, newatlas.com, newatlas.com/dropcopter. Look them up and see what they are. If I were a commercial pollinator, I would be very concerned. I thought I wrote a whole bunch of notes about this, but I guess I didn't. But what I'm telling you now is these are companies that have all gotten together, those that do the metering systems and those that do the navigation systems, and even DJI, who makes the Phantom and Inspire lines of drones. They also are making agricultural focused drone systems. So that's kind of a big deal. And one of the reasons that I don't like it, because those are what we call food deserts. And the reason that natural pollinators don't exist in pollen groves and things like that on the scale that they are in the state of California is that after that blossom period, there's nothing else for pollinators to eat. So native pollinators are very rare. They're not going to make it in that environment because we need biodiversity to maintain pollinators beyond the honeybees. So if the biodiversity doesn't exist, then the native pollinators are not teeming through that area and also helping with the the pollination services, the Apis mellifera, the honeybees that we're bringing in, which are non-native, by the way. So this is why it all falls under agriculture. But guess what? In my opinion, here's a concern I have. If they go to mechanized pollination like that, and they can pollinate in that way, and it's effective and proves to be more effective and dependable and predictable than the actual living honeybee, what else are they not going to care about anymore? They're not going to care about the biodiversity in their almond regions or in other areas where they're going to start to adopt these pollination services. If you're an investor, if you're a big money corporation that owns these, these agricultural land sectors, then you're going to go with the sure thing over the widely variable living organism of the honeybee. So then the other thing is, now that the honeybees are out, let's say they go fully mechanized. Let's say they use drop copters and all this other stuff. What do they not care about anymore? Pesticide. We can just put pesticides on everything now. I'm not saying they will. Not saying they won't. Because now the opportunity, if they don't have to consider the honeybees. I mean, in that movie, documentary, More Than Honey, the guy's right there with his honeybees, and the guy goes through and is spraying the crops. Now, I don't know if he's, spraying some kind of antifungal application, or if they're actually doing pest control or what they're doing, but they wouldn't stop their spraying even when the bees were there. And the other thing is, bees have to fly during daytime. These drop copters and stuff can fly day and night. So when the weather breaks and it's not raining, and they get that opening in those rare 2 weeks or whatever they need to have those pollination services done, these copters are flying day and night. These things have floodlights on them so they can navigate. It's amazing. Object avoidance. This weird branch sticks up the thing, stops, moves around it, and continues on its way. So that's where that's headed. But I see it, if they get a mechanized, dependable thing, they will care less about the environment than they ever did before and more about the bottom line. That's my opinion. If I'm a commercial beekeeper, I'm watching that, and now you're a backyard beekeeper who just knows about it. So number 10, I'm surprised that you treated your hives for varroa mites. Why did you make that decision, and how does oxalic acid kill mites? Okay, well, there were a lot of people. Actually, the blowback that I've received since I treated for mites this year with oxalic acid vaporization was less than I expected. Because I've been working with untreated bees for 10 years, and this year I added other colonies. And I did mite counts with sugar rolls, and figured out that my mite levels were high and that I had to treat them. And it wasn't just because of the weaver bees, it was because the Saskatraz bees were brought in. And also I brought in, as I mentioned earlier, a colony of bees from a swarm capture that were feral, unknown origin. So I treated with oxalic acid vaporization this year because the mite levels were high, and I will lose my bee colonies if I don't treat. So because I'm not a bee breeder, I don't think that it's important for me to allow bees to die out, because when I allow the colonies to die on their own due to a mite overload, it's not just the mites. They are disease-bearing colonies. When mites get a hold of the colony, the mites are carrying disease with them. So it is much more than just a parasitic mite that we're dealing with. So I rethought it, and if you've watched my videos, I was honest about that in the spring, and I decided to use oxalic acid vaporization, and the results were fantastic. Now, if I'm a queen breeder and I'm trying to breed selectively for varroa resistance, hygienic traits, and all of these other traits that exist in the bees that I buy in, I would not be treating, because I would be letting them die out so that I could get those who are strong on their own. But I'm not a breeder. I'm a backyard bee person who videos, photographs, and documents honeybee behavior at all levels, inside the hive, outside the hive, and everything that a bee does in its lifetime. So I want my bees to live. So then the next question is, that's my justification for what I've done. And another thing, before I get into this answer about, what it does to the mites, I want you to look at this magazine. This is the American Bee Journal. If you don't get a bee journal, this is December 2019 American Bee Journal. And it's timely because not only did I get this question, but guess what's in here? All of these studies about mite levels and how when you have, up here in this corner, when you have one mite-loaded colony of bees, what happens to the colonies of bees that are next to it? And then down here on this bottom chart, these black boxes are the colonies that expired due to mite overload. And it happens over a period of time. Some people, when you're brand new to bees and you get your first bees and you think, I'm going to go treatment free. And then, and look, they made it all through the year and they made it through winter. That's because just making it, there's a big difference in just making it through winter and just making it in spring and thriving through winter and spring. And in this study, it's that following year after the mites have built up in the fall and come into spring that the mites are being carried and transmitted from hive to hive. We know that workers drift. There's something called bee drift, and that's when foraging bees come in and they land on other landing boards, and because they're full of resources, nectar and pollen, they're admitted into that colony, and if they've got varroa on them, they are also migrating the varroa with them. So, I treat. And this was, I highly recommend you get this. If you don't get a bee journal, I'm going to put a link to this down in my video description. I highly recommend that you read the magazines that come out that clue us in on what's going on with bees, because that was very telling about how mites, because let's say I have the mite-resistant bees like the weaver bees, which I still think are fantastic bees. But because I'm evaluating other lines of bees, now I have the Saskatraz bees. Saskatraz bees loaded up on mites. It was pretty scary. So the mite counts that I got from them, they are next door to my weaver bees, and then I've got these Saskatraz bees. It is only a matter of time before they completely affect the other hives in my apiary. So you don't just spot treat them. I treat them all because I'm not a breeder. And I'm not going to be sending out mites from my apiary, for my bees, all over the place to infect other apiaries and other hives, and even maybe feral colonies that are existing in trees in the area where I live. Because if bees visit with each other, and if they can pass on, remember, it's not just the mites. They are disease carriers. So it's the disease and the pathogens that go with the bees as well. So even if there's this is how I used to think. If there's no mites on that bee, then they're not carrying the mites, then they're really not passing on any problems to other bees. That mite has a jump ship from this bee onto that bee. Well, it's worse than that, because the bee actually that comes out of a hive that's being overwhelmed with mites is carrying disease beyond the physical mite that might be on its body. So now we do have potential problems in spreading these things around. So the question is, how does oxalic acid, oxalic acid, and I use the vaporization, I don't use the dribble. And there have been a lot of studies about the dribble versus oxalic acid vaporization. First of all, it's a naturally occurring acid. This is how plants protect themselves. Like if you have rhubarb, you have oxalic acid in the rhubarb leaves. So plants defend themselves with oxalic acid. It makes things taste bitter. And so that other things don't eat the plant. So what happens is, I've always said that it gets on their feet or gets through their feet, because somebody that I respected said, well, when they walk on when the oxalic acid crystallizes inside the hive and gets on the surface of the bees and gets on the surface of the hive, then when these varroa, when their feet touch it, they die. Well, it's more involved than that. And of course, as with anything in beekeeping, we're learning more as the time goes by. And if you look at varroa mites, their teeny tiny feet have little suction areas on them, so they're moist. So their feet pads actually stick to bees, which help them hang on to stuff. So what happens is, the objective is to get oxalic acid vaporization, sublimation, so that it flows throughout the hive, and then it sticks and adheres itself to the fur on the bees, to their feet, to their bodies, to the surfaces of the hive. And the goal is to get these mites to put their feet, of course, on the bees. Now they're already on there. And because their feet are moist, they draw in the oxalic acid. And then it goes into their system. So that's one way of delivery. And then these mites can't handle the oxalic acid and they die. So somebody, like someone told me, oh, it burns the pads of their feet. It really doesn't burn the pads of their feet based on current studies. So what it does, it absorbs through and into their system. The other thing is the oxalic acid dribble method, which is something I do not do. But I want to talk about it because a lot of new beekeepers can go overboard on waging war on, the Varroa destructor mite, which feeds on bees. So, and also reproduces in the hive. So the hive is a reproductive center for these mites. So their host is there and they spread their disease while they're doing it. So then with the dribble, the bees actually are ingesting some of the oxalic acid. So the dribble is a sugar syrup, and it's got oxalic acid mixed into it. And then it's delivered that way, and the bees lick it up, they groom each other, and of course it sticks on their fur and everything, which is part of the goal, because you want to deliver oxalic acid-rich material so that the mites come in contact with it and they die. And then some people will say, yeah, wintertime's here, they're broodless, I'm treating, with the dribble. And you're going to find out that the people that are doing deep dives on oxalic acid treatments do not endorse using the dribble on bees going broodless into winter. Why? Because the bees take that on board and it goes into their gut. And oxalic acid has been proven to be damaging to the bees when they ingest it. So when you're using oxalic acid vapor, the honeybees themselves are not ingesting the material because it's not mixed with a sugar source that causes them to lick it and ingest it. And of course, the thinking is that if the bees can ingest that oxalic acid and it gets in their gut, then it's also in their hemolymph and it's also in their fat cells, because we get fat bees going into winter. And then those Varroa destructor mites start to feed on the bee, then they take the oxalic acid on board and the mite dies. The problem is the bees in wintertime, if they're treated with a drizzle, oxalic acid drizzle, then the dribble method, they can't go out to defecate. Bees do not go to the bathroom inside the hive, which is why when the weather breaks, as it's going to this week, the bees will fly out and the first thing they're going to do is they're going to defecate. So if you've got snow, you're going to see these little tan and brown spots in the snow right away. You might see it on the front of your hive. You might see it on the landing board. Those bees are holding all this material in their gut until they can fly out of the hive and then they can eliminate. So if you're going to do a late season drizzle method with oxalic acid, the bees are going to take that on board. They're not going to be able to defecate inside the hive because they simply won't. And instead, they suffer damage to their digestive system. And that's bad. You can read about the research that's going on and some of the detrimental aspects of this in Scientific Beekeeping, which is by Randy Oliver. And for example, some people just feel like if it kills mites, I want to use a lot of it. I want to do a lot of it. I want to get rid of those mites. But you have to think of what you're doing to the bees in the process. And in Scientific Beekeeping, when they talk about the drizzle method, you can actually deliver your colony with a 1-2 punch that actually takes out your colony in the wintertime if you're using oxalic acid dribble method. If you deliver it that way and they're eating it and they can't fly out, and then some people, there's another break or whatever, they feed them again, and then we go into a cold snap. They break cluster, they feed them, go into cold snap, they cluster back up. When they're clustered, they're not flying, they're not getting out of there. According to Scientific Beekeeping, you can actually kill your colony. So, while you're trying to treat mites. So this is how I arrived at my decision to use oxalic acid vaporization as my delivery method rather than the dribble method. So the other thing is, to do a dribble, you have to pull apart your hive, get in there and put it on the top bars of your brood frames. So it's more intrusive to do that. So in the wintertime, you shouldn't really be doing that anyway. Oxalic acid vaporization can be done without opening the hive, of course, and then you're hoping to do it when you do not have honey supers on for human consumption. And although, again, in scientific beekeeping, they show that the levels after treatment compared to prior to the treatment were not much different at all. It is just not approved in the United States to use oxalic acid vaporization with honey supers on. So when your bees are stuck inside and they can't do cleansing flights and they're forced to hold that material on board in their digestive system, it is not good to be using the dribble system. So it's a different story, of course, when it's warm, when the bees can fly freely and they can eliminate whatever is in their gut, and then that limits the exposure of the oxalic acid in the digestive system, so then the damage does not occur to the bees. But there is almost no question that that dribble system is potentially damaging to the bees. Okay, so that's how it works on the varroa mite. They're still studying the varroa mite, trying to figure out what gets to it. But it's important for you to know, because I know a lot of new beekeepers are thinking about what to treat with, when to treat with it. You know, you hear about broodless cycles, and that's the best time because it doesn't penetrate capped brood, so they want to get it when they're all exposed. And again, keep in mind this spring, when those packaged bees come in, I'm going to be doing oxalic acid vaporization of the package, and we're going to see how many varroa mites they bring with them, and how quickly after a varroa mite gets its little pads on there and they start to go into the system, how quickly does that act on the varroa mite? About 3 hours after exposure. You can expect your mites to start dying off, falling off of the bees. And so here we go. Here's number 11. We had a lot of questions this time, so I'm sorry this is running late. I do know some of you like for these talks to go late, but there were a lot, and thank you for submitting them. And can I just paint my hive interior surfaces with propolis since it's so beneficial to the bees? Thoughts? Okay, so Marla Spivak, Dr. Delaplane, Keith Delaplane, one of my early mentors in beekeeping. I learned my early stuff from a presentation series that Dr. Delaplane did, University of Georgia, chief entomologist. Anyway, they're doing research on, of course, the propolis envelope. So if you've been hearing about it, it's something, propolis used to be something that beekeepers scraped out of their hives, didn't want it in there, and thought that it was, a bother. And it comes from, tree resin. It comes from sap, and the bees bring it in, and it's how they seal up their hives. And now that Marla Spivak and others have found out that it can actually increase a hive's resistance to foul brood and other issues inside the hive, that it's medicinal. It creates a medicinal capsule, an envelope inside the hive. So people are thinking, I want to get that in there. How do I get more? Now they want it in, where before they wanted it out. So they want the propolis in here. Let me just show you what it looks like. Propolis has been used as a wood finish. This inner cover, I keep this just because the bees have loaded it with propolis through the years. And now I just use it for training. Because propolis is some interesting stuff. I mean, there's big globs of it here. So the bees really do bring it in and work it. So now people want to get it in the hive. So we're talking about propolis traps and all this other stuff. And so this person wants to paint, in fact, this person asked this question during a live chat. I did not get to it, so that's why I'm addressing it now. Can you just paint it in there? Well, what do you need to do to the propolis to paint it in? So if you have to heat it up and you have to make it liquid, propolis has been used as a wood finish, as a component in a wood finish, in shellacs and varnishes, and even the Stradivarius violins have bee propolis in the finish. So it has a lot of applications to protect wood, and bees use it to protect the interior of the space they occupy. So when the bees are living in trees and you cut apart that tree and you cut it open, all that pulpy wood and all that interior surface is covered in this propolis. And the bees maintain it themselves, and they refresh it constantly. when the weather's warm, when they can fly, and when they can bring in new stuff, they manipulate propolis. So it is the hive's antibacterial system. So it's natural that somebody would want to learn to paint their hive interior. I don't know how you could get your propolis in the quantity you need and then manipulate it in a way that would allow you to paint it on. So I'm totally in the dark on that, because if you had to heat it and process it, you'd kind of defeat its antibacterial properties. So what I've noticed is, like that inner cover, the bees will coat these surfaces on their own, but if there's a very smooth surface, the bees tend to leave it alone. So the bees fill cracks and joints with it. If they find little pieces inside the hive that they think should not be there, the bees don't want, and if they can't drag it out and get rid of it on their own, they propolize it. They seal it up and protect themselves from it, so that if it decomposes, it won't impact the hive in a negative way. So, but what I did notice is when I did my hive feeders this year, and the things that I make myself out of wood are from rough cut lumber. So here's a sample of that. And this is something, if you make beekeeping equipment, since we're talking about propolis, and it's something that, you know, let's look at this from different angles. This is rough cut lumber. So if this faces the interior of the hive, the bees are going to seal this entire surface. Now, when you look at lumber, sometimes you see something called S2S, S3S, and S4S. That just means surfaced 4 sides, surfaced 2 sides, surfaced 3 sides, and so on. So on the outside of it, this is pretty smooth. Okay? So that's a surfaced or planed surface. And then the rough cut side, see the difference? So if you're building your own hive equipment, I highly recommend that you go S3S, that you surface the outside smooth, the top joint smooth, and the bottom joint smooth, but leave the interior surface rough cut. And that is so that the bees will cover all of this with propolis, and then that will become an antibacterial barrier inside the hive, which is also, by the way, waterproof, and it just protects the bees in every way. So we've gone full circle from wanting propolis out of the hives to leaving it in the hives, and now we actually want to encourage the bees to do it. So if you look at these propolis traps and everything that people are starting to put in, that actually reduces the interior space that you have to work with. It can affect bee space if this is where your frames hang. So actually, I would like to see any manufacturer that makes beehive equipment begin to leave the interior surface of the hive components rough cut. And guess what that does? That benefits the bees. That saves the manufacturer from a finishing step, so they're not having to plane that down. It leaves the wood material thicker, because we know that a 1x6 or whatever is only 3/4 of an inch thick, where this one is a full inch. So if they're not surfacing that interior one, they can leave more material on, and now it's rough cut, and now the bees will propolize it. So if you're making your own equipment, I highly recommend you source rough cut lumber facing the inside of your hive, because my feeder shims that I put in all had rough cut lumber on them. Every one of the feeder shims, the entire underside is completely coated in propolis by the bees. So it's a huge benefit, and I think that it's good all the way around. So painting your interior surfaces with propolis might be difficult. Sourcing the propolis and finding a way to apply it without destroying the properties of it. And so my actual recommendation on that is get roughed surfaces. They're doing a lot of experiments on that. Dr. Delaplane is involved. Marla Spivak and others are doing research on this, and they're texturing and adding different things to it. But I just thought, well, they can add all that stuff all they want. The bees are already doing it on their own without any further manipulation to rough cut lumber. So that's what I recommend. Here's my last question. Barry, Penland. Temps are in the mid-20s at night and 40s also. So the 40s are the high during the day, dropping to the 20s at night. Yellow jackets are still foraging. Yellow jackets are trying to get into my beehives in the mornings. How long do yellow jackets stay active and do they cluster? I'm considering putting out traps. So here we are in winter, and it's not just yellow jackets, it's other wasps. We know that they have the ability to fly in colder temperatures than the honeybees do. That's why when you go out in the early mornings when it's only 35 or 40 degrees, it's amazing. You see these yellow jackets on the landing boards doing as he describes, trying to get into those entrances. And they do. Why? Because the bees are clustered, they're staying warm. And now the yellow jackets can cruise around and pick up the detritus that they want and get access to some nectar maybe if they're lucky. But so this time of year, temps in the 20s and 40s. Here's the thing. Because they're flying now, what happens? They don't cluster, first of all. So when it gets to the end of the season, and I'm talking about the northern United States, the yellow jackets that you're seeing now, if they're still out there, although now where I live with all the snow and everything, they're gone. They're done. So they left the nests. So the nests that you find are totally empty. Now, where do they go? So the last cycle for the wasps at the end of the year, they produce queens. Where do the queens go? The queens head out and they find places to overwinter. So where do they overwinter? They overwinter in decomposing material in my woods, for example. So if you turn over old rotted logs and things, when trees die in my woods, I leave them because I like to see what uses them. And you roll them over and you'll find a queen wasp in there all by herself. And so she's in that humus because it stays a little bit warm and she can breathe and she's just holding on to get through winter. Now the ones that you're seeing that are flying out here, because when it gets to 40 degrees or whatever, those are likely going to be queens. And so what they're after is nectar now. So putting out traps is kind of a waste of time, although if you did put out traps right now for them, they would capture queens. So here's one way that I catch wasps and hornets when the weather's cold and the bees are no longer flying. This is a gallon glass jar. I take honey and I pour a cup of honey in this jar and I lay it on its side and I put it wherever you see, like if you've got your apiary right now, too cold for them to fly. If there's no honeybees flying, you set this jar in that apiary and the wasps will go in here and they're going to get stuck in the honey. And you wait till the end of the day and the honey will be all full of the wasps that you've got flying around. Then you just close it up and you bring it inside and now you've got a bunch of wasps that you can classify. For me, I mean, that's what I'm collecting them for. And then I rinse them off and I put them on paper towels and now I can look at them very close and we can see what the largest queens are. And this year I got a whole pile of European hornets that way. So when the honeybees aren't flying, something like this is a great method for trapping the wasps and the hornets so that you can see what's around. I only got one bald-faced hornet, had a whole slew of yellow jackets, all queens, and then, of course, the European hornets. Now, because you're catching queens, when they winter over solitary, what they do then is, in the spring, those that have survived, each one of those queens will be making their own nest and starting fresh the following year. So in the fall, if you're collecting or trapping them, however you're doing it, but if you're going to put out a trap now, it's safe to use honey because the honeybees aren't foraging, so you'll only get the wasps. So what you've done is each wasp that you collect now eliminates a potential wasp nest in the spring. So it's a lot more bang for your buck, but don't forget, the paper wasps and things that I collect and use are highly beneficial and their benefits far outweigh the negative aspects of having them around. So consider the species that you're going to be catching. So for example, they'll go into little holes and tight spaces looking for food and resources. So it's up to you, but you need to also think about What is the detriment this time of year to have the wasps around as compared to the benefits of having them as pest control in 2020? So, but that's how you use honey this time of year when the bees are not flying and the wasps are, and you'll fill it up. You'll get all the wasps you want. And those are queens. So that's it for today. Those are all the questions. And I appreciate those of you who are still here, still watching. If you have questions of your own, now that this is over, please feel free to write them down in the comment section below. And in the opening sequence, we showed my coffee cups here, which these are bees and stuff. This says Honeybee Guru on the back, and then it has that phrase there. These are all designs that I made for the coffee cups and t-shirts, and everything else are down in my Teespring listing below. And feel free to go shopping. And for those of you who have watched this far, there's a discount link, and it's good until December 31st. And it is IWATCHED, IWATCHED 15. If you use that code on checkout for anything in the Teespring account, you get 15% off. And I appreciate it. And I think the newest one is, this is my beehive. Whoops. This is the beehive, which shows, all the things that I've had at the beehives. And it's, of course, a pen and ink sketch that I did. And I appreciate those of you who have bought those things. It's exciting for me to go into Teespring and see how many people have bought this stuff. And I really appreciate it, because that's a way to support my channel as well and get the word out to others that you support beekeeping and that you're a beekeeper yourself. So it's a great conversation starter. I hope all of you have a fantastic holiday break. And thank you for watching. Have a good day.